Hello folks, welcome to the Age of Asparagus and part 5 of making a 3D top-down shooter in Godot. By the end of this episode, we'll have a system that can spawn enemies in waves, and we'll be able to set the number of enemies and how fast they appear for each wave. We'll make it so that the next wave begins after all the enemies are killed in the current wave. Okay, let's start with our level selected. We're going to add a new spatial node, and we're going to call this spawner. And the position of this node is going to be where our enemies will spawn from, at least to start. And we're going to give this let's add a new script here called spawner. We're going to need a timer in our spawner. We can add that. And that timer will be when the timer runs out. Every time the timer runs out, we'll spawn a new enemy. So there's a few things we're going to need to spawn an enemy. One is we're going to need a reference to an enemy scene. Let's export a packed scene variable, and we'll call it enemy, if I can spell, enemy. Good. And let's go to our spawner. In the inspector we can drop our enemy scene in there. Let's go back to the spawner script. We'll need a reference to our timer, so let's create an onReady var timer. And a couple other pieces of data we'll need. Let's make these as export variables. One of them is the number of enemies we want to spawn, and the other one is how many seconds between spawns. We'll use that for our timer. And let's set this at 2, and we'll set this to start at 3. Okay, so in our ready method, we're going to set the timer's wait time to equal the seconds between spawns, whatever we set that to. And we're going to start the timer. We probably could just make it auto start as well. And let's connect to the timeout signal. And we want to connect it not to our level, we want to connect it to our spawner's script. And then we want to spawn an enemy. Spawn! So let's create an enemy, which will be an instance of our enemy scene. And obviously we don't want to spawn it under the spawner node. We want to spawn it as a direct child of the level. Now our spawner is always going to be itself a direct child of our level. So we can just make this a little easier on ourselves. And this time, to get the scene root, we'll just get our own parent. We'll get the parent node of our current node, which is the spawner. Current node is the spawner, and the parent is the level. And then we'll add a child to that, to the level, which is our enemy. All right, let's see what happens. I still have our 2 starting enemies. There's one, happened after 2 seconds. There's another. There's another. Okay, that's our 3. Oh, they keep coming, and they'll keep coming forever. Of course, because we never actually count how many come. So let's go to our, let's go to our level and delete these 2 nodes here. We don't need them anymore. Go back to our spawner script. So let's create a new variable that will track, which holds the enemies remaining to spawn. Long variable names, I know, but once you type them, the autocomplete basically makes it super easy, and it's kind of self-documenting. Okay, so we're going to start tracking the enemies remaining to spawn. So in our ready method here, we're going to set our enemies remaining to spawn, and we're going to set it equal to the number of enemies in our wave. And then every time we spawn an enemy, down here on our timer, we're going to subtract 1 from the number of enemies we want to spawn. Now, that's just going to count down and keep counting down because we don't actually use this anywhere, which is what we're going to do now. So select everything in here. I'm going to tab to indent it all, and we're going to create an if there are enemies remaining to spawn. If enemies remaining to spawn is 0, that's a falsy value, and that'll be false, and this won't happen. It's you could do this too if it makes you feel more comfortable, but if it is not 0, then it'll be truthy, and this code will run. So now we should get 3 enemies appearing, 2 seconds between each, and when it runs out of enemies, this will then be false, and the timer will keep ticking, but it will never run this code. So let's see if that's what happens. So there's our first enemy. second enemy, third enemy. Yep, beauty, looks good. Okay, but we want more than one wave, so why don't we create a new node which will hold all the information we want for a wave. So under the spawner, let's add a new child. This is just going to be a plain node, not that one, just a plain one. And we're going to add a new script to it. Just call it node. And let's go to our spawner and let's just steal this data right here. These two exported variables. So instead of having them in the spawner, we're going to have them as the two variables for our node. And now we can just duplicate this. Control D. Whoopsie. Oh, wow, that's neat. I didn't realize Control D duplicated a line of code in the editor. Okay, so let's go to the 3D editor here this time, and I'll select that node and I'll Control D, Control D. So we've got node, node 2, and node 3. And if I click on one of the nodes over here in the inspector, so node 1 is going to, we'll just leave it with the defaults 3 and 2. And then for the second one, we'll go, say, 5 and 1. And then for the third one, we'll just break everything because it's hilarious. And we'll go 50 and we'll go 0.1. So notice how 0.1 got changed back to an integer. That's because our default is an integer and the editor is assuming we want an integer. So let's go back to our node script. And here, let's tell it it's a float. And now if we go, we should be able to go to our third wave and then this time set it to, what we're going to set it to? Let's set it to 0.2. 50 coming at 0.2. So we have 3 and 2, 5 and 1, and then 50 and 0.2. Oh yeah. I think that's all we need for our node script. Okay, so now we're going to need to get those nodes. So let's create a variable called waves, and this is going to have a list of all the wave nodes. So or an array, in GD scripts referred to as array. Wave 1, wave 2, wave 3, and then etc. However many waves we have will be in this array. So we have a variable that's going to hold all the nodes, and then we also want a variable to hold the current wave, and this will be a wave node. And let's give it a type hint here. We know it's going to be a wave, so let's go over to this script and we'll give it a class name of wave, and then that way we should be able to give our current wave. Come on, is that because I didn't save it? Control S, go back to the spawner, wave. I want to see it autocomplete just so I know. There we go, good. Excellent. I realize we just left these called nodes. That is not what I want. So I'm going to rename these wave. It doesn't really matter, but visually it makes it easier to tell what's going on. Apparently I'm 0 index now, so there's wave 0, wave 1, wave 2. Back to the spawner script. So when we start, we want to fill up the waves variable with all of the wave objects. Now we could just get all the child nodes with get children. That's going to get all the children of our spawner, but unfortunately it's also going to include the timer, and we don't want the timer, we only want the waves. So let's just add a new child node here, just a blank node, and we're going to call it waves, and it's just going to act as an organizer, and then we're going to shift click all of these, and I can drop all my wave nodes underneath the waves organizer. So now, instead of getting the children of the spawner, I want to get the children of our waves node, because all of those children will be waves. And just to make sure that works, a little sanity check here, let's just print waves and see if we get a bunch of waves. I'm going to have to Control K that out right now because num enemies doesn't exist anymore. Neither does this. So all I want to see is that I'm printing a bunch of waves, like we're getting them properly. There they are, three nodes for those 3 waves. So now we do want to set enemies remaining to spawn. Control K, except it's not going to be num enemies, it's going to be the num enemies value of our current wave. So it looks like we need to set our current wave. Let's create a new variable called current wave number, And I'm going to set this equal to -1, and you'll see why in a moment. So when the game starts, we're going to do a bunch of stuff to start the wave, but that only happens at the very beginning. We're going to want to do this every time we switch waves, so it'd probably make sense for us to put this code into its own method. So let's go create a method called startNextWave, and we can just have it right here. I'm going to paste that code in here. Let's indent that back. We don't need to print the waves anymore. So when we start the next wave, the first thing we want to do is increment the current wave number. So we're going to add 1 to that. So now, let's start it at -1. Now it's going to equal 0. And that allows us to set our current wave, which should be a node, to the 0th element, or the index 0 of our waves list, which would be this one right here, the first wave. Or in my case, I actually named them like this, right? So if you kind of wanted to have a little helper reference there. So current wave number starts at -1. Now it's +1, which is 0. And so we're going to get the 0 index of our waves array, which is this one right here, right? And enemies remaining to spawn, we're going to current wave dot num enemies, and look at that, auto completions there, so we're definitely on the right object there. And the timer, I'm going to Control K that out. Instead of seconds between spawn, we want the current wave's number of seconds between spawns, and then we're going to start that timer. So when we start the next wave, whenever we call this method again, we'll increment current number by 1 more, then we'll go get the next wave in the list. We'll reset the enemies remaining to spawn to that wave's number of enemies and that wave's number of seconds, and then we'll start the timer again. Actually, we never really stopped the timer, so that might be unnecessary. Okay, is this gonna work? Good. 1, 2, 3. What do you think is gonna happen? Nothing happens because we never actually call start next wave again. We do it at the beginning, but basically the first wave goes, it runs out of enemies to spawn, the timer keeps going, but nothing happens after this. So we need to tell it when to start the next wave, and we want to start it when all the enemies from the previous wave are dead. So to do that, we're going to need to track how many enemies have been killed. So let's create a new variable, enemies killed this wave. And when we start a new wave, we're going to set that to 0. I'm just going to copy and paste this here. So when we start a new wave, no enemies have been killed yet. And if there are no enemies remaining to spawn, we can add an else block here, and we can check. So there's no more ready to be spawned, but there still might be enemies in the level that haven't been killed yet. So if there's no enemies remaining to spawn, we'll check if the enemies killed this wave equals the current wave's number of enemies. Basically saying if you've killed all the enemies, or if you've killed the same number of enemies as this wave will spawn, then we're going to start the next wave. So that's great, but it's actually not going to change anything because we never change enemies killed this wave. It's set to 0, and it just stays 0 for the whole thing. So somehow we need to know our spawner script needs to know when an enemy dies. Now, if we go back to the enemy scene, I don't know if you remember, but our stats node has a custom signal here. On stats you die, what is it called? On stats you died signal, right there. So we can use this, we can connect to this signal for the enemies that we're spawning, and when they die, we can run some code. So, oops, I clicked on my level there. Let's go back to the spawner script, and when an enemy is instanced here, we want to connect to its signals. So I'm just going to create a new method called connect to enemy signals. which doesn't exist yet. So I'm going to copy that. And above our signal function there, we'll create a new function called connect to enemy signals. Oops. The signal we want to connect to is actually in the enemy's stats node. Oops, I don't need to do that. Back to the spawner script. But in here we don't have access to the enemy, so we're actually going to need to send the enemy to this function. So here, there's the enemy. We'll send the enemy to this function, and I'm going to give it the type hint enemy. Which, does that exist? It doesn't. Okay, let's go to our enemy script up to the top here and give it a class name. That should be a lowercase n. How about that? Good. Okay, let's go back to our spawner script, and now it should let me know. Enemy, good. So let's get the stats node from the enemy. So we're going to go enemy. Now that we have it, we'll use get node. So this will get a child node of the enemy, and it's called stats. Guess I should put equals there, right? Okay. And now that we have the stats node, we can connect to its signal. How do we do that? Well, we go stats.connect, and now we have to give it the signal name. So these are the signal names that the editor thinks that the stats node has. And it doesn't have our custom node here because for all the editor knows, stats could be any kind of node. So it's just using the root node class and its signals. Actually, you can see they're these ones right here pretty much, right? So let's tell stats that it is a stats class. And once we do that, I'm hoping, do I need to retype these signals? There it is, yeah. So now it knows, and it'll pick up our custom signal. Okay, so to connect to the signal, we need to give it the signal name. And now we need to tell it where to connect. So what script do we want to connect it to? We want to connect it to this script that we're in right now, so I can use self. And now I need to tell it what method to connect to. Now the method doesn't exist yet, so I'm just going to type the name of a method. And I'm going to kind of follow the same naming conventions as other signal methods. So we do underscore on underscore. Now we put the node name where we're getting the signal from. So this is from the enemy's stats node. And then now we put the name of the signal, which is you died signal. Don't know if the signal part is necessary in my naming convention here. Okay, so now we need to create that function. And for now, let's just do a sanity check. I detected an enemy death. So if we properly connected to this signal, every time an enemy dies, we should run this method. That method exists here, and we're going to print enemy death. But there appears to be a problem because obviously I forgot the colon. Okay, let's run it. Now, just note, we have to connect to each individual enemy when it is spawned. So after an enemy is spawned, we're running this method to connect to its signals, and we're connecting to the specific signal of that enemy because we're getting that enemy's stats node, right? And we're connecting to that stats node's signal. So when that enemy dies, we know it's dead, separately from other ones. Yeah. I detected an enemy death. Beauty. Okay, we got it. Now, why did we do all this? We did all this because we need to count how many enemies have killed. And all we have to do is add 1 to that. And I'm going to, just because we want to track this, right? Enemies killed. And we'll just put in the number of enemies killed this wave. Bring it. 1, 2, enemies killed 1. Enemies killed 1. Well, good thing we did that because that's not working properly. Why is it always enemies killed 1? Because I wrote equals plus. That would be the same as saying equal positive 1, which is just equals 1. So let's go plus equals. How about this time? Get out of the way and start plowing through them. Boom, enemies killed 1. Enemies killed 2. Now is wave 2 going to start? It did! It started! And they're starting and they're coming faster! Every 1 second. Oh no. Oh no, you know what's going to happen, right? Wave 3. Here comes wave 3. Ah! Oh, this is wonderful. I wonder if I can stay in the middle. Oh, they're pushing me out. Ah! Okay. We're going to have a problem though, which is going to take me forever. But if I kill all these enemies, which is taking a long time, so I'm just going to skip this as I do it and go to the error, which is going to happen when it tries to go to wave 4, which doesn't exist yet. Okay, here comes the error. Boom! Right, we're trying to get to index 3, which is 0, 1, 2, and there is no more. So the last thing we need to handle is the last wave, which is pretty easy to do, right? Let's go back to the spawner script. And when we go to start the next wave, let's check. We're going to indent all this, and we're going to make sure that the current wave is less than the size of the waves array. And if we do that, we should be golden. Oh, right. Current wave is a node, which doesn't exist yet because we never set it. We want to check if the current wave number is less than the size of the waves array.